We are continuing to make our way through the life of David. David is, he's really one of the most significant people in the entire biblical story. And David's legacy, both in the Old Testament, which is the first part of the Bible, and the New Testament, David's legacy is that he's a man after God's heart. That's kind of how he's described, but his story is really complex because David starts out as a shepherd, he's a poet, he's a musician, he becomes a warrior, an outlaw, eventually he'll be king, but he's also a murderer and an adulterer. So he has this really complex story, and we're really making our way through his story, trying to understand, like, hey, with all these highs and lows and all these great moments and all these moments of epic failure, what is it about his life that makes him a man after God's own heart? And what is it we learn in David's life about God? And what is it we learn about what it means to live a life that's after God's heart? And when we left off, David had essentially become an outlaw. David had been chosen, he'd been anointed by Samuel. Samuel was a prophet, someone who spoke on behalf of God, and Samuel had anointed David to become the next king of Israel. And so David was on his way to becoming king, but he wasn't currently the king. The current king was a guy by the name of Saul, and Saul was actually the first king in Israel's history. And Saul, when he became king, he started off really promising and then just tanked. And as you continue to read the story, Saul just spirals further and further and further and further downward. And Saul has made it his mission to eliminate David, because Saul knows that David's been appointed the next king, that he's been anointed the next king. And because of that, Saul knows that his time as a king is limited, and even his family's line, his dynasty, is not going to reign, and he doesn't like that. So Saul thinks, if I can eliminate David, I can secure my power and I can secure my family's dynasty. So he keeps trying to go after David and kill him, but David keeps evading Saul. Now, David refuses to fight Saul. He refuses to kill Saul. At one point, he even spares Saul's life. He has the opportunity to kill him, and he won't. Because from David's perspective, David says, listen, you may be out to kill me. You may see me as a threat, but you're the king. And I know I may be the next king, but until I'm the king, I'm not the king. You are. And as long as you're the king, I'm going to respect you, and I'm not going to fight you, and I'm not going to kill you. And so when we last left off, Saul had temporarily halted his pursuit of David. Saul had gone back home, and David had stayed in the wilderness with his men. David at this point has 600 men that have rallied around him that are his kind of outlaw rebel fighting force. And Saul has gone back home and says, I'm not going to kill you anymore. We'll get back to Saul and David and that national soap opera next week, because Saul has only temporarily paused his pursuit of David. He's going to take it back up again. But what we're going to look at today is almost kind of like this interlude when you read through this story of David. That in Israel at this time, there's this national soap opera between Saul and David. Everyone knows Saul's the king. Everyone knows David because he beat Goliath, the Philistine. He saved Israel. He's this warrior. He's this champion. And they know about this rivalry and how Saul's out to get him. And they're aware of that. But then in the middle of that soap opera, there's this break for this cool little story that's not just about David, but it's about David and this guy Nabal and his wife Abigail. And it's almost just like an aside from the big story that's going on. But I think this story about David and Nabal and Abigail really has a lot to say to us. And when we're first introduced to Nabal and Abigail, here's what we're told about Nabal and Abigail. 1 Samuel 25, verse 3. She was intelligent and a beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. So what we're told about Nabal is that the words that are used there are surly and mean. Literally, you could translate those as hard and evil. So this guy is a jerk. He's a complete jerk. And his name, Nabal, actually means foolish, which I don't know why you would name someone foolish. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen those, like you get those bookmarks that have your name on it and then they tell you what your name means. But it's always a good name. It's always like your name means warrior or your name means child of light or something like that. I mean, I can't imagine you pick one up and it says like your name means idiot. But that's what Nabal's is. His name literally means foolish, and he is this mean, ornery jerk of a guy. We're also told, and this is important to the story, that he's a Calebite. And the reason why that's important is what that tells us is that he comes from a prominent family in Israel, particularly in the region of Judah, which Judah is one of the 12 tribes that makes up Israel, and the territory they're given in Israel is down to the south. And the family, the Calebite family that Nabal comes from, actually founded the city of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem is most famous because it's the city that Jesus was born in, if you're familiar with the Christmas story. The reason Jesus is born in Bethlehem is because Bethlehem is the city of David. Jesus is ultimately a descendant of David, and Bethlehem is David's hometown. So the fact that Nabal is a Calebite means that him and David are related. Now, they're probably not close relations or, I don't know, second, third, fourth, fifth cousins or something, but they're from the same family. They're from the same prominent family that founded the city of Bethlehem. And so Nabal isn't just some random person. He's not even just a fellow Israelite. This is David's kinsman. Now, Abigail is described as the polar opposite of her mean, angry jerk of a husband. She is described as intelligent and beautiful. Earlier in the story of David, if you go back to the story of David and Saul and their rivalry, David, even though he was technically an outlaw from King Saul, David had really acted many times to protect his fellow Israelites. That there was moments where Israel's neighbors were attacking or were invading Israelite territories and Israelite cities, and David has used his fighting force to protect his fellow Israelites. One of the regions that David protected was the region that Nabal lives in. Nabal is very wealthy. And so part of what has allowed him to secure his wealth is that David and his men have protected Nabal and his family and his household from these invading neighbors. Now, one of the challenges David has is how does he provide for all these people that are with him? Because again, David's technically an outlaw and he's hiding out in the wilderness. He has these 600 men, but that's just the men. So the number of people around David is greater than that because the 600 men doesn't count wives and children and all that. So David has, in addition to those 600, another 1,000, maybe even as many as 2,000 more people that are out there with him. So how do you provide supplies and food for all these people while you're hiding out in the wilderness? And so this now is where Nabal enters the story of David. 1 Samuel 25, verse 4. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men, and he said to them, "Go to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours.'" So sheep shearing would happen twice a year. It would happen twice a year. And when they would shear the sheep, that is how they would gain a profit from being a shepherd, because they would trade the sheep fur for other supplies, or they would use it to make clothes, or whatever they used. That was how they would produce profit from being a shepherd. So twice a year, Nabal would shear his sheep, and he would get his profit from that. And so David knows that he needs to supply all these people with him with all the food and supplies that they need. And David also knows, hey, we've protected Nabal and we've allowed him to produce and amass wealth and we've kept his people safe. So David sends this small group of young men. He says, hey, go to Nabal, and when you go to him, be really nice and be really respectful. So they go to Nabal and they offer him and his whole household this blessing. And as a part of that blessing, they go on and they remind Nabal of who David is. They actually remind them that there's this family connection. And they do it in a really respectful way because they refer to David as Nabal's son. That they're not literally meaning father-son, but hey, you are kinsmen, your family, and they even offer Nabal the greater position in the family, that he is your son. He's a part of your family. They also remind Nabal what David did for you, that his people were literally a wall around you, that they protected you. And ultimately, what this small group asks is they ask Nabal, will you now essentially give a gift to David and to his people because he's your family, because he's provided for you, because he's protected you. And they don't ask for a specific gift. They don't even ask for a specific amount. They basically just say, hey, Nabal, whatever you feel is appropriate. Whatever you want to give to David because he's your family and because he's provided and protected you, would you please give a gift? So the way that they go about asking for this gift and the fact that they even ask for a gift is culturally completely appropriate. That's what you do. If someone provided for you and protected you and allowed you to amass wealth, then you would respond by, hey, let me help you out. Here's this gift so that you can continue to protect my family so that we can continue to thrive. So everything that David does, everything that his men do is respectful, it's nice, and it's completely appropriate. But remember, Nabal's an idiot, and he's mean. So here's how he responds. Verse 10, Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" So Nabal says, no, first of all, I'm not giving you anything. But he doesn't just say no, he says no in about the most disrespectful way that you can say no. I mean, the first thing he says is, "Who is this David?" Which is a stupid question because everybody in Israel knows who David is. Everybody. He's arguably the most famous person in Israel. Everyone knows about the soap opera between him and Saul. Not only that, but Nabal knows he's family because in the very next phrase, he says, "this son of Jesse," who's David's father, who's also a part of Nabal's family. So Nabal acknowledges, like, okay, he may be this infamous warrior that's protected everybody. He may be family, but I'm not giving him anything. Nabal actually refers to David and his men as slaves. And so he doesn't just say no, he says no in the most disrespectful, mean, personal way possible. David's delegation then returns to David and says, okay, we went, we did everything you asked. We were nice, we were respectful, we presented everything. Here's how Nabal responded. After hearing his response, here's what David does. Verse 13, David said to his men, "Each of you strap on your sword." So they did, and David strapped on his as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. I have this very vivid memory of when I was in 8th grade in junior high. I don't know if you have memories like this, but some memories I can just see clearly, almost like it was like yesterday, even though it was like 30 years ago. And I remember this day specifically. I was with my friends in the quad at Griffiths Middle School down in California, about 30 minutes up the road here. And we were in the quad, and we were hanging out, and on one end of the quad, David was talking to Melissa. Now, there's technically nothing wrong with David talking to Melissa, except for the fact that at that time, Melissa was dating Jeremy, who was all the way over on the other end of the quad. There was some debate as to whether David was talking to Melissa or flirting with Melissa. I don't really know, I wasn't there, but the report that got to Jeremy was, hey, David's over there flirting with your girlfriend. So what Jeremy did in an instant is he got one of his friends, one of his boys, the two of them charged across the campus. And I remember sitting back, I remember watching this whole thing develop. You saw it. You saw David and Melissa talking. You saw Jeremy and his friend, they weren't running, but they were walking fast. And he walks across campus. And when Jeremy walks across campus and he gets over there, he doesn't say a word to either one of them. He literally just pushes David down, jumps on top of him, and just starts punching him. Like, just hitting him, shouting all kinds of obscenities and screaming at him. The security guards came over. The security guards peeled him off. They took both of these guys to the office, and they're shouting obscenities at each other, and they're all bloodied. That's what's happening. Okay, David has been disrespected, and so David says, okay, I'm going to get my boys, we're going to march over there, and we're going to beat the ever-loving crud out of this guy. In fact, we're going to kill him and probably his entire household. This is what David's response is. David had provided, he protected, he said, hey, can you give me a gift in response for that? Nabal, completely disrespectful. And David says, okay, you're going to disrespect me, I'm going to get my boys. And notice, he takes 400 of his 600 men. A force that's clearly going to overpower Nabal. And he's going to march over there and just wipe out Nabal and really his whole family and his whole household. But this now is where Abigail enters the story. Now, up to this point, Abigail doesn't know anything that's happened. She's aware of David. She knows who David is, and she's aware that David, you can read it in the text, that David has been good to us. That's what it says. David has been good to us. She's also aware, and this is another direct quote, she's aware that her husband is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. And so Abigail is given this report, and she's told, hey, David sent this group of people. They asked for a gift. Here's how Nabal replied. David and his men are on their way now, and they're going to wipe out our whole household. And so now Abigail is brought up to speed, and Abigail knows, okay, we're all going to get killed here unless I do something. I've got to intervene here. So, 1 Samuel 25, verse 18, Abigail acted quickly. Like, listen, my husband has endangered our entire house, and if I don't do something quick, we're all going to get killed. Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them onto donkeys. Then she told her servants, go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal, because she is a smart person. So Abigail says, okay, he's endangered us all. He's going to get us all killed. I've got to do something quick. So she loads up what is a sizable gift. Now, for the 1,000, 2,000, however many people David has, it's not really enough to sustain them for any length of period of time, but it is a generous, sizable gift. And she loads it up. She says to her servants, you go, I'm going to catch up to you. She sends the gift out. Then she herself goes riding out, and she doesn't tell her husband. She's like, he's endangered us all. I'm now going to go save us all. So when Abigail and her gift, when they approach David, we're told that David and his men are riding down into the valley. So it's close. They're getting close. They're coming down into where Nabal is, getting ready to just wipe out this whole household. And when Abigail rides up, we're given a glimpse into the conversation that David is having at the moment she rides up. And I have to imagine that this is a conversation that David is having audibly, but it's also part of his internal monologue. Because here's the conversation David's having, verse 21. David had just said, when Abigail rides up, he had just said, it's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. He's paid me back, and here's the key, evil for good. I did good, he repaid me evil, it was useless. And really what David's doing is he's gearing himself and his men up for the bloodshed that they're just about to levy on Nabal's house. Because that's, whenever you're going to go into something that you think is like, hey, this is going to be confrontational or this is going to be a fight, you kind of have that inner dialogue to like build yourself up. Like, here's why this is okay. Here's why we're doing it. Here's why these people deserve this. They deserve this because of what they've done. So this is what David is doing. I think in his mind and also out loud, here's why we're going to do this. Because of what we did for these people, what they did for us, we did good, they repaid us evil. This is justified. This is what's right. This is what we're going to do. So this is what David is actively doing as they're coming down into the valley. And this is when Abigail shows up. Verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Now again, everyone in Israel knows who David is. And at this point, everyone was well aware of the fact that David has been anointed to be the next king. Early on, it was kind of a secret, but now by this point, everyone knows. So Abigail is very much aware of who David is, which means she's also aware of who David isn't. And she knows that David is not the king. And because he's not the king, she's also not his servant. And so what Abigail does here is really, really smart, because Abigail essentially is not addressing David for who he is. She's addressing David for who he's going to become. She's not his servant. He's not her Lord, but he's going to be. Abigail's well aware. Everyone at this point can see the writing on the wall. They know where this is going. They know Saul's spiraling further and further out of control. They know everything that David touches essentially turns to gold. It's just everything's success. Everyone can see. And so she kind of peers into the future and she says, I'm going to treat you for who you are going to be, for who you're becoming. And so whereas her husband had responded to David with kind of arrogance and rudeness, she's very kind and she's very humble. So she falls before David, treats him as if he's the king. And in verse 25, she says, please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my Lord sent. When Abigail falls down before David and is treating him as the king, she says, what I guarantee you, every wife in here has said at some point in their marriage, please forgive my idiot husband. Like at some point you've looked at a group of people, or if you've looked at someone else and you've just said, yeah, my husband's an idiot, just please ignore him. And guys, let's be honest, I'm a husband. I try to be a good husband, but there has been many times where I've been an idiot. And sometimes, like people look at me, why did you do that? And I'm like, I don't know, because something inside of me is idiotic sometimes. And so that's her response. She falls before David. She says, please, please, my husband is stupid. Everyone knows that. Everything he does is stupid. He's an idiot. He's a jerk. She says, please, please ignore him. Forgive him. She says, I'm sorry. I did not know. And this is important. She's going to say, I didn't know. I didn't know you sent these men. I didn't know what you asked for. But she's going to go on, and what she's going to say is, but now I know. Now I know, and so now we can make this right. And this is where I'm going to read some of her continued response to David, but her response to David is really interesting because she's never going to ask him not to go kill Nabal and the whole household. She's never going to say, please don't do this. She's going to imply that it's just, you don't need to do it anymore. She's basically going to say, it's already stopped. She's not going to say, please stop. She's going to say, no, because now I know, and because I'm here, and because I have this gift, now no one needs to die, so crisis averted. So she's really, really sharp because she understands, hey, the problem here is you deserved a gift, you didn't get a gift, you got rudeness, and you were on your way to kill Nabal and his household, as you rightfully should have, but guess what? I found out, I'm here, here's the gift, we don't need to shed blood. And so here's what she says, verse 28, please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord. Again, she's talking about who David's going to become and where he's going to go. Because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, so again, now she's acknowledging the soap opera between Saul. She's like, look, I know there's people that are against you, but the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling, which is her reference to the whole Goliath story. When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. And so again, Abigail's response is brilliant because she talks again about where this is all going. And she goes, look, David, it is clear to me and it is clear to everyone. You are going to become king. Saul, this guy who's pursuing you, trying to kill you, he's spiraling further and further out of control. Everything you do is victorious. The enemies that rise up against you, they're defeated. And that's why she makes a reference to that sling. That's how David killed Goliath. Like, look, you went up against impossible odds and you were victorious. And everything God has said he's going to do for you, he's going to do. You're going to overcome all this. You are going to be king. This is all going to be yours. And then essentially what she does is she poses this really interesting question. She says, when you become king and you look back on this moment, what is it you want to say? Andy Stanley, the way he words it, he says, here's essentially the question that Abigail poses to David. The question is, what story do you want to tell when this is nothing but a story that you tell? But David, you're going to be king. You're going to be king over all this. You're going to get whatever you want, and no one's going to be able to stand against you. And when that happens, David, and when you look back on this moment, and when you tell your kids and your grandkids and your friends, and you're sitting on the throne, and you're talking about the good old days, what is it that you want to say in this? What's the story that you want to tell? Do you want to talk about how you wiped out an entire Israelite household because of this one idiot guy? Or do you want to look back and say, you know, I acted with grace and forgiveness? David, when this is nothing but a story that you tell, what is the story that you want to tell? And see, I think that's a question that you and I should wrestle with from time to time. Like when you get to the future and you look back on this moment in your life, at your work, in your job, even this moment in history, this cultural moment. And when you're talking to your friends, to your family, to your kids, to your grandkids, what's the story that you want to tell them in the midst of all this that's going on in your life and in the world? As all this was going on, here's what I did. When this moment, when this time is nothing but a story that you tell, what is the story that you want to be able to tell? And that's the question that Abigail poses to David. Verse 32, David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." David says, Abigail, thank God for you because you prevented this. You did. I was on my way to kill Nabal and your whole household because of what he did, and rightfully so. But Abigail, thank God for you because you are the one in this story that had the better judgment. You are the one that used wisdom, and you have prevented this. And so David takes the gift and he goes back to his people. Abigail goes back to her home, and when she gets back home, her husband Nabal, the idiot, is indulging himself in a big party, and he's completely drunk. And Abigail decides, probably not a good time to tell him what I just did, so I'll just wait in the morning till he sobers up. So she waits for him to sober up in the morning, and she tells him, hey, here's what I did. And literally, I don't know if he's embarrassed, angry, ashamed. I don't know exactly what the emotion is, but literally, his heart fails. And a couple days later, he dies. And as soon as David finds out that Nabal is dead, David sends word to Abigail, and he's like, hey, you are smart and you are beautiful, and I would really like it if you would be my wife now that you're single. And we're told that Abigail quickly goes to David and becomes his wife. And so you have, again, in the middle of this national soap opera between David and Saul, you have this story about David and Nabal and Abigail. And you have these three people. And you have the way that each one of them responds. And here's this kind of chart that breaks down their response. It breaks down how they kind of interact. First of all, you have Nabal. And what Nabal does is Nabal gives evil for good. That Nabal is given something really good. He's given protection. He's protected from these enemies that would invade and conquer and destroy his family, his land, and his wealth. David protects him, provides for him. And the way that Nabal responds to David's goodness is with evil. When you respond to goodness with evil, that is stupid. It just is. If someone does something good for you, someone does something nice for you, someone does something kind for you, and you respond by being a jerk, by being mean, by gossip, whatever, that's stupid. The second response is David's response. Who, when Nabal sends back David's messengers, he sends back this completely disrespectful message. It's mean, it's evil, it's disrespectful. So David has been disrespected. So how does David respond to the evil that's been given to him? He responds with evil, which is the typical way that you would respond. It's the typical way in David's world. It's the typical way in our world. Israel, under David's time, functions under what we call the Mosaic Law. It's the law that God gave to Moses. And part of the Mosaic Law is this phrase you may be familiar with. It's an eye for an eye. This is what happens. You do something for me, I do something for you. You do something good for me, I do something good for you. You do something bad for me, I do something bad for you. You take an eye from me, I take an eye from you. So that's typical. That's how we would expect someone to respond. If someone was mean to you, someone in your neighborhood, someone at your work, someone in your family, what everyone would expect was for you to be mean back to that person. Like, they called me this, so I called them that. Well, yeah, that's typical. Then you have Abigail. Abigail, who because of her marriage to Nabal, she is guilty by association in this evil disrespect that's paid toward David. Remember, that's the language that David used. I've been repaid evil for the good I've given. So Abigail is there's this evilness, but Abigail responds to that evil with good. David's on his way to kill us. He's going to wipe out the whole thing. And how am I going to respond to David's threat to my family? I'm going to respond with goodness. I'm going to respond with kindness, with generosity, with love. And see, when you respond to evil with good, that's extraordinary. And so the question that you and I have to wrestle with is, do you want to be stupid, typical, or extraordinary? That's the choice that we have. We can either as people, we can be stupid, we can be typical, or we can be extraordinary. Now, Abigail, when you look at this, like the overarching biblical story, like the entire Bible is made up of all these books, it's all these different stories and texts that come together, but there's one main story about what it is that God is doing to restore and redeem creation. And so when you look at like the overarching story in the Bible, what you find with Abigail is actually just way ahead of her time. In fact, she's about 1,000 years ahead of her time. Because about 1,000 years after Abigail, when Jesus shows up, Jesus will reference the Mosaic Law, which is still what the descendants of Israel were living under during the time of Jesus, this whole eye for an eye thing. And Jesus will actually say, he'll say, hey, I know you've heard it said, an eye for an eye. I know that's the rule, I know that's the law, I know that's the ethic. But then Jesus will use this other phrase that he likes. Say, I know you've heard it said, eye for an eye, but I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. So Jesus takes the whole thing and flips it, and he actually is advocating for exactly what Abigail does. Jesus will say, hey, if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other one also. That when someone gives you evil, what you do is you repay it with good. And so Paul, who writes a big chunk of the New Testament, Paul, based on the words of Jesus in Romans 12:1, Paul will actually say you should overcome evil with good. And one of Jesus' best friends, a guy by the name of Peter writes a letter that we have in the New Testament called 1 Peter, and in that letter, here's what Peter will say. And again, this is him taking the words of Jesus. And Peter will write, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. See, Peter takes these words of Jesus and he says, listen, when people treat you evil, or when people insult you, don't repay them with evil and don't repay them with an insult. When you're treated evil, repay that with good. And Peter uses this language. He says, you were called to this. What that means, you're called to this, Peter's saying, this is what it means to be Christian. To be a Christian means that when you are treated evil, you respond with good, because that's when you and I are the most like Jesus. Years ago, when we moved into our house, our kids were young. My daughter was like a baby at the time, and we moved into our new house, and we were having a little bit of work done on the house before we moved in. And so there was a guy that would come work on the house, and when he would work on the house, he would park his truck in the driveway, and then the other part of the driveway, he would have supplies. Sometimes he'd have saws or drywall or 2x4s or whatever was out there. And so we weren't living in the house at the time. We were living with my parents, but we'd go there sometimes during the day to do things. But I would never park in the driveway because there was always stuff in the driveway. So I would park in the street. And I didn't even realize it at the time, but apparently I was parking like kind of by my neighbors, and I was taking up a spot that could have been used for 2 cars. And so we came there one day, and one of our neighbors had left us a note explaining that we were parking in front of their house and we were taking up 2 parking spaces. Now, that explanation is completely fine. Like I was doing that. I didn't mean to do that. I wasn't even aware that I was doing that. The problem wasn't the letter itself. The problem was that the letter was really mean and personal. Like, you know how people can tell you something like, hey, did you know you're doing this? And could you not do this? Or people can just like attack you. Like this letter was really mean and like called us names and all these things. And so as I'm reading this letter, like on the one hand, there's this acknowledgement like, oh, I guess being a good neighbor is, first of all, I'm like, well, it's a public street. I can park wherever I want, dummy. But anyway, that's beside the point. Like it's just really mean. And so as I'm reading this letter and my wife's reading this letter, like there's 2 emotions that I'm experiencing simultaneously back and forth. The first is anger and the second is fear, which when someone is mean to us, when someone pays us with evil, those are typically the 2 emotions that we fear, is fear and anger. Anger because why you said like, I can't believe you're saying this. I can't believe you're this mean. But there's also this fear of like, we're going to live here. We're going to raise our kids here. And our neighbors now apparently hate us. They hate our kids. They're going to trip our kids when they ride their bike on the sidewalk, or they're going to like call the police on them. But like, this is not the way you want to start. You don't want to move into a neighborhood and already have enemies that like hate your guts. And so in my mind, I'm like going back and forth, like what do we do? How do we respond? I got anger on one hand, I got fear on the other hand. Thank God for my wife, who in her brilliance and in her loveliness and her kindness says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to buy them frozen yogurt gift cards. And so we bought them frozen yogurt gift cards. And we delivered it. We found out who it was. We knew a couple of our neighbors at that time, but we found out like who it was. We gave them frozen yogurt gift cards. And for the next 10 years, they were really good neighbors. Actually moved away not too long ago. They were good neighbors. They were friends. They were nice. We'd get together at like neighborhood barbecues, and we'd always talk with them and talk with them, when you're taking out the trash. See, what we have to learn is that typically, it's not the first action that sets the trajectory of a relationship. It's the reaction. It's not the first thing that someone does. It's how we react and how we respond that sets the trajectory for where the relationship goes and for where the story goes. And this is the brilliance of Abigail. That Abigail is actually the one that sets the trajectory of where the story goes, even though she's the third of the three people to act. That David does his thing, Nabal does his thing, but it's her reaction, it's her response, it's how she responds to evil with good that ultimately sets the trajectory of where this thing goes. See, the problem, one of the biggest problems in our world, in our culture, in our society, is we're stuck in this evil for evil. A lot of us are stuck this way in our relationships, maybe even marriages, maybe in our families, maybe our communities. We're stuck this way as a society, as a culture. It's just, they did evil, so we're going to do evil, so we're going to do evil, so we're going to do evil. And it just escalates. And we do it because, like David, we feel justified. Well, this is what this person did, or this is what these people did, so this is what we're going to do. But the problem is, evil for evil, all it does is bring destruction. You want to transform people, you want to transform families, you want to transform communities, societies, you want to transform the world, you live like Abigail. You respond to evil with good. And like Peter says, this is what it means to be Christian. This is when we're the most like Jesus, because the Christian story, like Christianity is essentially a story. It's a story about how God is making the world right. And the heart of the Christian story is God giving good for evil. That in the place of human sin, which is destroying the world, God gives Jesus. And Jesus, through his death and resurrection, is overcoming sin and death and making all things new. That's the Christian story. And so our lives intersect. Our stories become a part of God's story. We live like Jesus when we respond like Abigail. When we respond to evil with good. Because that's who God is, that's the heart of the Christian story, and this is what it means to be a Christian. This is what it means to bring hope, to bring healing, to bring life, is to respond to evil with good. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much that you respond to evil with good. That in the face of destruction and death and despair, in the face of sin, you came yourself in the person of Jesus, and you gave yourself freely. And it's through your death and resurrection that you are overcoming sin and death, and you are making all things new. That is the Christian story. It's what we call the gospel, the good news. That you have responded to evil with good, and you are making all things new. And Father, I pray that we would be people. I pray that we would be a church that embodies that we would be a church that lives the way that Abigail lives. That we might feel justified in returning evil for evil. And that may be expected and it may be typical, but Father, the church wasn't created to be typical. It was created to be extraordinary. And I know we won't always get it perfect. We won't get it right 100% of the time. But Father, I pray through the strength of your presence that's with us. I pray from the strength that we get from one another and being together, that you will help us to live the way that Abigail lived, to live the way that Jesus lived, to live as people who respond to evil with good. Father, we love you. We thank you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.